The Mezzogiorno, the zenith, the noontime, the region of the midday sun. It's untranslatable. But here, in the harbour of Bari on the Adriatic Sea, just before lunch, when the shops are shuttered and the windows blinded against the glare, you know what it means. It has its own customs and its own culture. It even has its own newspaper, the Gazzetta del Mezzogiorno, to distinguish it from the rest of Italy. From the flat wetlands of Lombardy and Emilia-Romagna, from the fecund hills of Tuscany and Umbria, from Machiavelli and Titian and man as the measure of all things, from Verdi and Manzoni and Garibaldi and the might of emergent 19th century Italy, Europe's newest nation-state. Over the horizon is Albania. Down there to the south, in the Salento, is a village called Kalimera, which is the Greek for good morning, and in some towns nearby they still speak a Greek dialect. Five provinces, stark and savage Abruzzi, where Berlioz wandered with the brigands, sensual Campania, where actor and Norman Douglas completed the grand tour, cruising the Spanish palaces of the Aragonese, bare Basilicata, where the writer Carlo Levi was exiled by the fascists in a land of indescribable irreligious isolation, and Puglia, Apulia, the heel, Land's End, with Bari as its capital city. But the Barese novelist and commentator Raffaele Nigro looks beyond the Adriatic to another wider world.
Il Sud Italia, in questo momento, si trova a vivere.
At present, the south of Italy is a kind of bridge culture.
Di ponte o di paese ponte tra Oriente e Occidente.
A bridge between East and West.
In Italia meridionale, noi ci sentiamo molto vicini.
We feel ourselves very close to the Arab world, because their urban landscape is very similar to our old town centres. Their gestures are very like ours, and all this makes us very close to the Mediterranean basin.
The writer Corrado Augias also sees the south as a separate world, a world we discovered last week when we visited the village of Aliano, described in Carlo Levi's book, Christ Stopped at Eboli.
He discovered with surprise and horror this word he was not aware of, and he wrote this very important book. Why so? Because there is a different concept of time, for instance. There is a different idea of what we call solidarity. Like if out of your home's door begins not a part common to all, but a part of the world which belongs to nobody.
It's 3 weeks since we left Rome, following Horace on his journey down the legendary Appian Way between the Mediterranean and the Adriatic. The Appia, the great highway built 3 centuries before Christ to carry Roman troops and Roman customs to the fringes of the empire and bring the plunder of Dacia, Persia and Africa back to the powerhouse of the Latin world. And now our road has developed schizophrenia. The old Appia goes south to the Ionian port of Taranto. The Appia Traiana travels north to the Pulian capital of Bari, Horace's route. This is how he describes it.
From that point on, Apulia began to bring into view her familiar hills. They were scorched, as usual, by the Scirocco. We bowled along in wagons for 24 miles, putting up in a little town where they sell the most common of all commodities, water. But their bread is unbeatable, and a traveller, if wise, usually carries some with him. For the sort you get at Canosa is gritty, and your jug is no better off for water. On the next day, the weather was better, but the road worse, all the way to the walls of Bari, renowned for fish.
Horace was a Treasury civil servant who doubled as a diplomat. He seems to have been developing the Latin edition of the Witch Report as a sideline. Bari is dismissed in a single sentence, which is a pity because it's a rather intriguing town. Bari, known for fish. Not today, not now. What Bari is known for today is light industry and petty crime. At one time it was the most criminal city in the country. Not because of the industry. By southern standards it's been something of a success. No, for other reasons. Because over its shoulder is the economically disadvantaged empty countryside of northern Puglia, and ahead is the narrowest channel of the Adriatic, which makes it an ideal escape route for refugees and asylum seekers from Albania and former Yugoslavia. I've just picked up an edition of the Gazzetta del Mezzogiorno at the nearest newspaper stand, and it's in Albanian. Why this great interest in Albania?
Alla fine del 400,
At the end of the 15th century, the Turks invaded the small kingdom of Albania, and the Albanians fled to the
gli
west.
albanesi fuggono verso occidente.
Raffaele Nigro is a journalist and novelist who's taken a special interest in the relationship between southern Italy and the wider developing world.
E popolano tanti paesi dell'Italia.
And they populated many regions of the Italian south, and they live there to this day.
Comunità che vivono ancora oggi.
Another southern paradox. We've been collecting them ever since we left Naples. This is a prosperous town, and its prosperity is based on its resilience. Down here in the Piazza Mercantile, with the heaving fish market to our left and the port in front of us, with its grand Risorgimento frontages and broad boulevards, this could be Marseille or Barcelona. Like every city which absorbs immigrants, it balances the risk of social disruption with the benefits of migrant energy and enterprise. The chime of the bells blends with the walkie-talkies of the local police. And there's something else. I'm sitting in a charming little restaurant in the appropriately named Piazza Mercantile, where Bourbon Bari meets Risorgimento Bari. And I'm surrounded by Bari businessmen in elegantly tailored suits, doing deals over the orecchiette for all the world as if we were in a prosperous corner of Milan or Turin. They're probably complaining that the centre-right coalition, for which they voted last year, isn't moving swiftly enough to deal with Italy's immigration problems. But Raffaele Nigro turns these disturbing tensions on their head. He sees immigrant culture as a resource from which we can learn. He's one of a group of international thinkers who see southern Italy as linked more closely to the value systems of Africa and the Near East, emerging from their recent colonial histories, than to the driven history of their northern European neighbours.
Non ci sentiamo totalmente figli del Mediterraneo e non ci sentiamo totalmente figli dell'Occidente.
We don't feel completely children of the Mediterranean and not wholly children of the West. We're between the two cultures.
Un paese ponte, vicini al sud e vicini al nord, lontani
When I say we're a bridge culture, far from the south, far from the north, this is very important.
L'Europa sta vivendo da oltre un secolo
In our century, Europe lives in a nihilistic value system, tied to a culture of prosperity.
legato all'ideologia del benessere. Di fronte abbiamo
To the south of us, we have poor nations who achieve a form of well-being which is denied to us.
poveri che corrono verso il benessere che non hanno.
It's not the first thing that comes to mind as we follow the Appian Way down towards its destination in Brindisi. This coastline has something of the dusty feel of Greece, but it's becoming more colonised. Little villas are springing up among the dunes and palms. I'm told that wealthy commercial and industrial barons from Rome are beginning to look on the Pulian coast as a fashionable weekend hideaway. But this isn't the Ligurian Riviera or the Amalfi coast. The hard blue sky and the ultramarine Adriatic and the white coves with their rough-cast lighthouses conjure up triremes rather than luxury yachts. There are few resorts along here, and the roadside is littered with Roman remains. In fact, the remains are beginning to outnumber the little white villas. We're nearing Eniatia, Ganatia, on whom the water nymphs scowled, in another of Horace's neat aphorisms. It's strange and oddly touching. The further you travel from the tourist track, the more respectfully they tend the fragmented heritage. This is a city as carefully protected as ancient Rome, but it's untarnished by commercial concessions and cheap cafes. And running alongside is that same Appia Traiana we first met in Benevento, the extension of the Appian Way built by Trajan. But of course, it can't have been, because Horace travelled this way a century before Trajan.
Dopo che Taranto viene sconfitta, cioè Taranto viene presa
After Taranto was occupied by the Albanians from Epirus, it declined.
Taranto decade. E al posto della
In the place of the Appia Antica, another road was created, called the Minuccia.
che sarà la Minuccia.
The museum makes it all clear. Another airy, elegantly laid out collection, just like the one in the Samnite Museum in Benevento. But Eniatia is older than the Samnites. It's a Messapian city from many centuries before the Roman Empire, greatly influenced by the Greeks and then built over by the Romans. This is a very ancient town, bisected by a very ancient road. Trajan didn't build it, he just made sure it was named after him, the way of politicians since the dawn of time, claiming credit for other people's achievements. The spectacular statues here aren't Roman, but Messapian, and they're more Greek than anything I've seen since my Appian journey began. There's a delicate figurine of a woman with a dove on her shoulder, a light and vigorous marble statue of Eros and Psyche. Over here there are stunning vases from the 4th century BC, with languid women fanned by servants, gazing at themselves in mirrors while winged cupids hover overhead. There's Rome as well, of course. How could there not be? But not the crashing triumphalist Rome of Trajan and his arch and his expropriated highway. Most of all, in room after ravishing room, there are mosaic pavements from Roman villas. A man framed by two bright-eyed women, paying them far less attention than I would. And returning to the Hellenic vases, I can see that much of this delicious pottery has the same origin in the burial mounds unearthed all over the Ionian coast. Because this is the heart of Magna Graecia. The map on the wall here reveals how it happened. The trading routes from Crete and the Peloponnese to Cyprus, back to Paestum near Naples, up to Rome, and across to Sardinia. Traders and exiles, like the first Greek-speaking settlers on this southern soil. Like Aeneas, I suppose, come from Carthage and his abandoned Dido, with the word Italy on his lips, just as we read in the masterpiece by Horace's dear friend, the poet Virgil. Traders and exiles, like the Albanians the Forza Italia is striving so resolutely to remove. This is where Horace and I part company again. He continued down the Adriatic coast on the road that became known as the Via Traiana to Brindisi. But as we know, it wasn't the original route. Horace had turned east at Beneventum, while the first road, built in 312 BC, turned south. It was making for Metapontum and the Ionian Sea. It's not far from here as the crow flies, to Metaponto and Taranto, the great Ionian ports where the Roman fleet was harboured in preparation for its North African conquests. So let's cut straight across the instep of Italy, into those white hills over there, scorched by the Scirocco, just as Horace says. As a matter of fact, they're hardly scorched at all, not in late April, and certainly not after Baron Basilicata. I admit, on this side, facing the sea, They're quite rocky and sparse in their vegetation. But it doesn't take long for the landscape to change once again. Low, dry stone walls everywhere, cutting the red earth into regular, carefully tended plots. Market gardens with little armies of tomatoes and turnips and cultivated rocket. Vineyards, not the serried ranks of vines you see on Tuscan hillsides, but tumbling, profligate branches of young grapes sucking goodness from the rusty earth. And olives, olives as far as the eye can see, ancient twisted trees like characters from Ovid's Metamorphoses, fixed and frozen at some passionate legendary moment. Scorched by the Scirocco be damned, this place is almost obscenely fertile. No, this isn't the disadvantaged, neglected Mezzogiorno, which scarred the consciences of liberal Italy in the 1950s. It's largely rural, and like most agricultural regions, it lost population to the cities in the 60s and 70s. But that's not poverty, just cultural difference.
The east part of the south is already one step forward, especially Puglia is much richer also of artistic heritage and the industries. So there is already a mentality being richer that doesn't wait only for the statal help.
The Neapolitan cultural activist Mirella Baracco. But former communist leader Alfredo Reichlin comes from Puglia, and he takes a darker view of post-war developments in the south.
L'industria si sviluppa nel nord.
Industry developed in the north. At this point, the Mezzogiorno took on a subsidiary role.
L'industria si sviluppa al nord.
Industry developed in the north, the south provided the cheap labor.
Il nord
The north sold their products to the south, and so, with 20 million inhabitants, the south became a captive market.
Puglia's never quite come to terms with the attempts by northern politicians to tell her what's good for her. This is one of the rural south's economic experiments, the town of Taranto. Taranto is Taras, the city founded by Spartans in the 7th century BC, when the Greek Empire began to unravel. It was named after the son of the sea god Poseidon. It was the principal port on the Ionian Sea and the metropolis of Magna Graecia. It furnished all those marvellous mosaics we saw in Ignazia. But that's not what people conjure up when they think of Taranto. Over here, beyond the dual carriageway, which seems to be in a permanent state of reconstruction, is the huge smoking pile of the Italcida chemical works, smearing the skyline with a yellow wash. The shores which welcomed the grandchildren of Menelaus are now festering in industrial rust.
La democrazia cristiana, il governo decide di.
The Christian Democrat government tried to industrialize the Mezzogiorno to the extent that they were building cathedrals in the desert. There was no diversity of enterprise. There was a great investment in Taranto and in petrochemicals in Brindisi, in the hope that it would spread.
Si mette in moto un processo diffusivo. Questo non è avvenuto.
This didn't happen.
Taranto is two towns separated by two seas. We're on an island linked to the mainland by a bridge with the sea on either side. To our left is the Mare Piccolo, with fishing boats bobbing by the quayside, and lines of twine marking out the mussel beds as they have done for centuries. In Horace's day, the murex of Taranto was often left to rot, and it yielded a purple dye which tinted the robes of Roman emperors. The Ionian coast has some of the best seafood in Italy, they say. And then there's the navy. To our right, hovering in the hazy cocktail of heat and chemical pollution, are rows of grey warships. Not just any warships. They're Italy's most substantial NATO force. They've been here since the end of the Kosovo War, waiting nervously to see if the peace will hold. When I was in Sarajevo 2 years ago, the place was full of Italian Marines. Taranto, a town of sailors and fishermen and traders. There's something rather reassuring about that. Now we're in the comfortable, confident commercial quarter of Taranto, the 19th century city which is spread along the shores of the Mare Grande all the way to the Lidos east of Metaponto. The central piazza has an oddly Latin American feel to it, with crumbling rust-coloured facades framed by palms. Perhaps it's a hangover from the Aragonese, who held sway over Taranto, as they once did over every corner of the Mezzogiorno. The shops are as well appointed as anywhere in provincial Italy. The passeggiatas humming. But are they buying or window shopping? Look at the peeling facades above street level. Or the town museum, which my guidebook says contains the finest collection of Spartan artifacts anywhere, the best of Magna Grecia. It's been closed for restoration for months, and its collection shunted off to the old city. And there are those who say that Taranto's prosperity is as fragile as those Aragonese facades. Perhaps I should ask my friend Gianfranco Campo. I met him by accident 5 years ago when I stopped at a fish restaurant down near the swing bridge that separates the two seas and was greeted with some of the finest fish on the Ionian Sea. Sometimes Gianfranco's up at 6 in the morning to make sure he grabs the best of the day's catch in the fish market. This is the soul of Taranto. It's squeezed onto one side of the tiny island which lies between the two seas, a midden of crumbling houses, walls plastered with tattered posters, with a shoal of tiny boats unloading their cargo onto the quayside. Bass and bream and mollusks of every description. The smell is so ripe you could do your shopping blindfold. And what else is here, apart from resting sailors and rotting seafood?
My place is one of the more celebrated places in the south of Italy. But now in our city have a problem about the work. They go straight on the steel company. The steel, you know very well, have a problem 30 years ago. We opened with the second generation of steel, but the Japanese people have the 40th generation of steel.
So the steel was not a success here?
No, sure.
What happened?
The fabric is inside the city with a big problem of air pollution.
Gianfranco's restaurant has fish of gleaming freshness and a splendid piano nobile for private parties. All that's lacking are customers. And the same is true almost everywhere in town. A business district with no business.
We have lose a lot of touristic people. We have lose the people who come in Taranto for look at the museum, the National Museum Archaeological, one of the most important museum in Europe, not in Italy, in Europe. Now, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, is closed for reconstruction, and now is closed.
And if we make our way back across the swing bridge, we can see why. The fish market is finished for the day, and the harbour's sweating in the sun. Let's turn off here, just by these two columns at the entrance of the old town. They're all that's left of the Doric temple of Poseidon, father of Taras, father of Taranto. The castle back there was built by Ferdinand of Spain, and it still guards the naval port. Now we've plunged into a crumbling warren of medieval streets. The smell of fish is everywhere. The rusty balconies are draped with washing. And apart from old ladies staring at me from open kitchen doors, there's not a soul to be seen. They're supposed to be restoring the old town, and there's plenty of fine architecture for them to get their teeth into, but they'll have to get a move on if they're to beat the encroaching decay. I'm looking for the Palazzo Pantaleo, where all those ravishing Spartan ceramics and jewellery have been rehoused. And here it is, just before we turn the corner into the empty fish market. Totally empty as well, dusty and disregarded. The lighting is flat and dim, and half the exhibits are missing. There are meant to be thousands of Greek terracotta figures here, the largest collection in the world, but many of them are missing. One or two handsome ceramics have managed to escape the storeroom. These elegant athletes give some idea of what the civilization of Magna Graecia was like at its high season. But everything else is casually scattered around or carefully locked away. No wonder the tourists are giving Taranto a miss.
No enterprise. They don't change the vocation of steel. They have forgot our very vocation, who is the tourism, the agricultural, the museum point, very important.
It's the same paradox which has been pursuing us all the way from Campania. How does the Mezzogiorno adapt to the modern world? If industry isn't the answer, then what are the alternatives? Cultural tourism? But doesn't that just devour the very heritage which feeds it? Or does the damage go deeper?
Noi abbiamo un nord borghese.
We have a bourgeois north, which is cold in
Poi
character,
abbiamo un sud più popolare, più popolare.
and we have a more populous south, which has been in the process of abandoning a peasant culture and embracing a bourgeois culture.
Ma questi fatti sono molto
And these things are very significant, because the bourgeois northern culture is also an industrial culture,
L'Italia ha significato anche una cultura industriale.
and industrial culture arrived very late in the
La
south,
cultura industriale è arrivata molto tardi. E questo ha significato
which means that wealth and prosperity also arrived much later.
della ricchezza e del benessere.
With all that money, that huge amount of money, they didn't help a process of changing the problems, and on the contrary, they gave the idea to people that only by having always help from the government they could live.
Like so many cultural activists in the Mezzogiorno, Mirella Baracco traces its problems back to the intercessions of the government in the 1960s.
That made a really different mentality, the mentality that doesn't trust its own work, but it's only waiting for help from the central government. And that's a great problem to change.
It's a neat answer. Leave the South to itself, to its rich rural and dynastic history, its olive groves and Bourbon fortresses, its vineyards and Spanish palazzi. Or is there something else? I have a friend who lives near Taranto, Rosa Lupo, who's a distinguished criminal lawyer in the region. Much of her time is spent clearing up the debris of Taranto's brief flirtation with heavy industry.
L'avvento dell'Italsider, adesso che si chiama Ilva a Taranto, ha creato apparentemente.
The arrival of Italsider in Taranto appeared to create substantial employment and prosperity. The peasants left the field for state employment because that's the dream of everyone in the south. They abandoned the countryside for Italsider. And as I said, the benefits were only apparent because, for example, here in Taranto, there was the increased burden of deaths caused by lung cancer because the atmosphere was virtually destroyed.
But the writer Gaia Savadio insists that the South has more to be proud of than simply its agrarian and cultural heritage.
In a way, the South seems to be a prisoner of itself. I think would be mad to think, let's make the South into a garden of culture and that's that. Also because the South has got much more to contribute. First of all, its brains. A nation needs to think and needs to pay people to think and to look towards something, to have hope.
Not far to go now. Only 60 kilometres between one sea and another. Not the Mare Piccolo and the Mare Grande, but the Ionian and the Adriatic. Between Taranto, the doorway to Africa, and Brindisi and the gates of Greece. A nondescript road. The Roman paving stones were stolen centuries ago to furnish the barns and villas which nestle among the olive groves. Vines and cherry trees and more vines. Nothing to draw the tourist. But it drew me. It drew me 5 years ago, driving with my wife along this dusty tarmac replacement of the Appia, searching for the source of that burnt bottle of wine we'd tasted in London. That was in a pizzeria where all the waiters were Puglians, and they showed us a book they'd written with money from UNESCO about Magna Grecia and Greco, the dialect peppered with phrases of Greek and Albanian that they speak in some of the more remote villages. We'd worked our way across from the west, not along the Appian Way, but through the Abruzzi Mountains and down the coast from the tacky resorts around Pescara to the Gargano Peninsula and then to Salento in the far south, where the city of Lecce lords it over the region, with better Baroque architecture than you'll see anywhere south of Rome. Avete qui ciminerati? No, vabbè. Cicoli. Mezzo chilo, se vuole. But it wasn't the buildings or the wine. Europe isn't short of distinguished Baroque, and you can buy a decent bottle of Coppettino Riserva in Sainsbury's. The ancient olive trees, perhaps, and the rich earth and those low, dry stone walls. Changeless and, yes, profoundly conservative. Nothing's wasted here. The local pasta's served with cime di rape, turnip tops. Forza Italia is very strong in this region. Berlusconi's promise of devolution and reduced bureaucracy strikes a chord with all these suspicious southerners who look on Rome as the hostile north. Although the great estates were broken up after the war, and smallholders like these were encouraged with tax breaks, much of this land was bought back into the same families who owned it centuries ago. I have a friend here whose father worked as an indentured labourer for the Prince of Serranova up there between Brindisi and Bari. More than a friend, actually. We bought a little house and some olive trees from him a couple of years ago. That's the effect that Puglia has on you. So, at the end of this ancient road, am I coming home? People are embarrassingly hospitable here. They ask you when you're coming back, and they ply you with plastic bags overflowing with tomatoes and peppers from their market gardens. They want you to love this place as they do. It's not difficult, but I'm under no illusions. I'm just another traveller, like the Greeks and the French and the Spanish and the Austrians and, first and last, the Albanians, who settled this fecund stretch of Italy for century after century. That's another paradox of the South. It has a huge sense of continuity, and yet it bears the mark of migrants everywhere you look, in the Spanish Baroque palaces, and the Bourbon fortresses, and the Crusader castles. There was one celebrated crusader who left his mark on Puglia, in town after town as he ploughed across the peninsula. They called him Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who built all the massive mystical castles which haunt Basilicata and Puglia. His headquarters in the impregnable keep of Melfi, the weird geometrical conundrum with 8 octagonal towers which is Castel del Monte, the austere and elegant pile we saw in the harbour at Bari. And just up the road here, I can see it standing proud above the plain of Salento, embraced by gentle, fertile gardens, the castle of Oria. Now there's something interesting over here on the right as we enter the Centro Storico. A menorah, a Jewish candelabrum. It's marking the entry to the ghetto. There's scarcely any sign of the ghetto here today. Mussolini's fascists made sure of that. But its existence tells us something important about the wonder of the world. Frederick let the Jews into the south. He governed the Holy Roman Empire from Melfi back there in Basilicata, and he governed it as a freethinker, tolerant of Muslims, Jews, and almost anyone else except the papacy with whom he was at war for most of his reign. He was supposed to have said that the three great frauds of history were Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Why this potted history lesson so late in our journey? Well, look at the grave stillness of this castle and its serene gardens. Like all the other Hohenstaufen castles down here, it bears the marks of Frederick's reflective, all-embracing, inquisitive mind. Perhaps all that Hellenism rubbed off on him. He was born in Palermo, a scholarly city back in the Middle Ages before the Cosa Nostra. Frederick was no mean scholar himself. He wrote the world's first manual of ornithology. He founded Naples University, Italy's first secular university, partly to put two fingers up to the Pope, who was in league with the University of Bologna. His political aim was to supplant papal power, rid himself of the troublesome German states across the Alps, and govern all of Italy from here in the south. One of the great what-ifs of history. Because Frederick's dream was short-lived, and the Papal States allied with the Lombard League to put paid to his ambitions. But what if Frederick had succeeded? What if Italy were turned on its head, and the Renaissance happened not in Florence, but in Melfi, or Palermo, or Taranto, where the residue of Greece was still a living force? It's all very well to say that Africa begins at Rome, but the barbarians came in from the north. Remember all that ravishing Hellenistic art in Ignazia and the Samnite Museum in Benevento, and the crude Lombard carvings which supplanted it. There was a time when the South held all the cultural cards. Heresy? It's time to catch up with Horace at Brindisi. Only 30 more kilometres to go. Another raffish port. Rougher and less prosperous even than Taranto. A statue of Augustus Caesar, I see, holding an Italian flag. He's had a long wait. A forest of signs and shop fronts advertising ferries to Turkey, Albania and Crete. The grass by the ferry terminal is littered with sunbathing backpackers who've breezed through the Mezzogiorno on their way to a sun even fiercer than ours. Africa certainly begins at Brindisi and Albania. The street is littered with vendors selling cheap radios and imitation mobile phones in the shape of Teletubbies. But it's a magnificent harbour, almost entirely enclosed by a circular spit of land. In Horace's time, it was the point of departure for all those galleys bound for Asia Minor. Now it's southern Europe's most significant UN port. Those cruisers down there are pointing towards former Yugoslavia, but they might equally have their sights set on Iraq. Let's just cut across here past the school kids to the cathedral. No, don't worry, I'll spare you more Gothic treasures. But just on the other side of the square here are two last echoes of the travellers of Puglia. These Neo-Byzantine columns mark out the House of the Templars, the crusading knights who scattered almshouses, inns and hospices across the Mediterranean. Inside, there's a museum of the sea. What else? There are barnacle-crusted amphorae and the rebuilt remains of two statues, salvage from the Adriatic. Like Sinuessa and parts of Gnatia, Brindisi's fought its own battles with the sea, and not everyone ended in victory. But the Appia ends here, on the strand at Brindisi, with two broken columns erected to mark the conclusion of the Western world's oldest and most celebrated highway. They're cased in tatty barbed wire and clapboard fencing, and they're chipping away trying to remove the graffiti. The end of the Via Appia, frozen in a Mezzogiorno eternity of restoration. I think Frederick would have made a better job of it. Such a downbeat coda to our journey. No flourish of trumpets, no swirl of banners. But then, Brindisi isn't a destination. It's a point of departure. Look over here. The sign on the side of the piazza. The Piazza Virgilio. Horace's dear friend. What does it say? The greatest of Latin poets, of war and the fields. Virgil, who travelled with him from Campania. He died here. He was taken ill on the way back from another journey, this time to his beloved Greece. Brindisi was a point of departure for Virgil, not to Asia Minor, but to the Elysian fields. And round the corner there's another sign. Forgive the lousy translation. Hail to he who arrives. Hail to he who departs. Hail to those bearing eagles of war. And then it welcomes those who practice the ancient sciences and the arts. The building it graces belongs to the local coast guards. All those migrants, practicing science and the arts and, yes, bearing the eagles of war, they're only human. Virgil retired to his Campanian farm, but something took him on that final journey to Greece. All those travellers, poets and politicians like Horace and Acton, writers like Dickens and Lear, warrior scholars like Frederick II and Lord Nelson, Normans, Angevins, Aragonese, Bourbon, Arabs and Jews. And the empires they served didn't die. Their stones were recycled into other kingdoms. Their roads of conquest and ports of passage were transformed into trading routes. Templars and troubadours, all on their way somewhere. And the only things that are permanent are the sea and the sky and those ancient olive trees and the red, red earth.
Mezzogiorno was written and presented by Dennis Marks. It was recorded on location by Tim Alcock with technical presentation by Tony Was. Appian Way is a director's cut production for BBC Radio 3.